Welcome to a new episode of the Creative Industry Insight podcast. I'm your host, Bobby. Today, we welcome Director Sophie Oliver, who joins us to talk about their work on Boyzone, No Matter What. Sophie will talk us through making a documentary about the iconic boy band and how she went about prepping and conducting the interviews. Please be warned there are heavy spoilers in this episode. Now let's jump into the conversation with Sophie. Hi Sophie, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to sit down and talk about your latest work on Boyzone, No Matter What, which has just aired now on Sky documentaries. How have you found the reception to the documentary?
Do you know what? It's been really, really good. I knew there was like a cohort of, Boyzone fans or, my friends from school that were really excited about it. But actually, it's had a much bigger buzz than I thought it would have. And actually, I knew it was something that attract a big audience, but it also created like a buzz like within my contemporaries in the industry. And you always wonder with documentaries, obviously, it's like, it's not a hard hitting like subject matter in that way. But actually what I think the series does is go into like, more sort of complicated and darker themes. And it's not a sort of poppy boy band light documentary. So it's actually had a great buzz. And obviously, because, the guys are who they are, it was just a bit mad in the press and there was just so much tabloid and newspapers and stuff. So it's had a buzz on like many levels, but it's been really nice because you don't always get that on projects.
I can imagine as well because it's like sometimes there is a band means so much to people that there's a kind of already a built-in audience, which probably helps quite a lot knowing that you can go after people who will be interested. But then also you kind of bring people like myself in who I'm not really Boyzone's target audience, but I'm still interested to watch it and see what they have to say. And I guess you're kind of like it's like a magician pulling back the curtain and how things work and how people are entertaining you, but actually it's like we're working really hard, like constantly around the clock.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely hit an audience that didn't typically. I thought, it'd be a very sort I mean, I haven't seen like what the actual gender thing, but I thought it'd be quite a female skewing audience. But actually, Shane in the band said he had people kind of come up to men in the street who normally when they were in the band, they wouldn't get much attention from men, or if they did get attention from men, it would be sort of a lot of taking the mick or not being very nice to them. But actually, he'd had like men walking up to him in the street and sort of shaking his hand and being like, I watched it with my wife, but actually, I just thought it was amazing. So it's nice that it's resonated with different people than I guess it did when they were kind of in the 90s and in the pop band.
I know my sister was a massive Boyzone fan, so obviously it was like it was always there in our house because you had the posters up, and I don't remember music being played because I don't because it's like they don't. Maybe I was just slightly a bit too young for Boyzone then because I remember growing up with like Five and Blue and probably a few others as well that completely slipped my mind. But how did the project come about, and what made you want to take it on?
So I was working with a company called Curious Films, and I had been talking to them for like I'd really wanted to work with them. You've got Dov Friedman, Charlie Russell, and they've got an amazing team there, and I'd wanted to work with them for a while, but like the sort of stars hadn't aligned. And also, I was really keen to work with Sky and do a sort of retrospective, the stuff I'd been doing before. I've been doing like a more sort of obs docs, and I'd just done a single for Channel 4. So it kind of the stars aligned. And then I met Dov and he sort of mentioned Boyzone. And I thought, okay, like, do you know what? That's quite different tonally from what I had done before. And then I sort of started looking into it a bit more and actually thought there was like some stuff to really grab onto. There was the Stephen Gately story, and actually when I met them, I was just sort of fascinated by sort of them outside the band. But how it came about from a sort of curious perspective is they had quite a strong reputation in documentaries, but also kind of popular culture icons. They'd done a documentary about Amy Winehouse and Caroline Flack and Paula Yates. And so they had a really strong reputation. So when they approached the band members, that conversation kind of went on for like 6 months to a year of sort of discussing if it was the right time and what would be the right story. So there's like, it sort of stars align for me, and then there's like a really long process before you start filming.
I can imagine as well, like the conversations with band members can you have to sort of like lead them, be like basically like leading a horse to water and seeing if they'll drink or what they'll pick up on it. And there's also how are you going to deal with things that have happened in the past and not necessarily like demons, but there's probably like old wounds for things that have happened in like as a band members and stuff that you've dealt with, which is like, oh, how do we do this? Like, what's the reckoning for this?
Mm.
Um, and I can imagine that's like very difficult as well because you kind of have to. It's kind of like in a way, it's a like therapy probably because you'll
It's
have to
quite
strip.
cathartic experience. Yeah.
Yeah, and you're stripping back so much about what you're doing and what you've done, and also how you felt at certain times because, one moment you could be leading the band, the next moment you're not. And then you see early on about certain people being removed from the band as well. It's like having that anxiety and then sort of speaking about having that fear of being like, oh, I can't mess this up because they can, click of fingers and you're gone.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's like, it's that time with them before you start filming is so vital. And and I think was difficult about this, and the sort of fear I had with this documentary, is that they had been interviewed so many times before, and there's always a kind of worry, okay, could they just turn up and do the same anecdotes that they've done before? And am I going to be able to get something new and something interesting? So I think that time just spent with them, not filming, them getting to know me getting to know them, really learning a bit more, I think was really sort of vital in this particular documentary. And then also like the preparation for the interview is huge. And, we interviewed them all over different days, and what order you interview them, and what order you do the question, like all of that plays a sort of part in it. And then also, talk about like they did really open up. So I think you can't just kind of leave the interview and then be like, bye, I've got everything. It's like carrying on that conversation afterwards and the care afterwards. And I still talk to some of them now and just keep checking in and stuff, because although they've been in the public eye a lot, it is still like quite a big undertaking for them. And it was quite an emotional experience for them, especially even like watching it back was quite an emotional experience for quite a lot of them.
I think as well, like because it's stuff gets aired on TV, people can also do clippings for the internet. It's like they're putting themselves out there. It's just like another way of an artist showcasing their work, but they're kind of talking about themselves more than anything.
Mm.
And like even as you mentioned there, like that was really important is it's like feels like you have the pre-production period of like talking to them, making them comfortable, showing that you're not there to sort of exploit them. And then you have like the production process of their filming, and then the post part where you still have to sort of show that you're not sort of exploiting them and you kind of show that you've always cared. But then also just checking in because I can imagine like because they're being so open to you as well as like you have a different kind of bond as well,
Yeah,
compared to I don't know, it's maybe a family member.
yeah. And also with I've done lots of projects with really like much more than these guys as well, like really, really sort of sensitive topics. And you always feel that sense of like emotional responsibility of someone sort of giving you their story and their emotions, and you capturing on camera, and then you're creating it in the edit and putting it out there. Like there is quite a big responsibility that I always feel like the people that I'm most nervous about watching it are the people that are in it, because you want them to kind of look at it and go, yes, this is a true reflection, even if parts of it they find challenging, that it's a true reflection of their story. And that's quite a big responsibility that kind of sits on your shoulders.
Yeah, of course, and add to it as well, like that they're sort of sh basically like be showing that like being their true selves rather than
Mm.
their stage personas of, cheeky people or people who like
Yeah,
be mischievous and sort of fun.
yeah.
Um, and you can see that like there is that side to it a little bit, and I think that's when you see them when you see the three other boys meet up again, and he asks about where he got his hair done. That would kind of make me chuckle. But when you have that sort of openness as well, because it's like I think it's Keith who ends up on Coronation Street, and he says about how even though it's like kind of like scratching an itch creatively, it's still not like fulfilling what he wants to do, and how he sort of still misses out. And I feel like that's it felt slightly relevant to me because it's like being at that crossroads. It's like you always want that little bit extra, even though you are kind of doing what you want to do.
Yeah, I think I met Ronan, Keith, and Shane together, and it was like really, really fascinating, sort of watching them, the dynamics of them as a three. Mikey didn't actually come on until much later in the process. We didn't know if he was definitely going to be part of the series when we started making it, but. As much as I love the dynamic of seeing them together, and we wanted to capture that, and we did, it was really clear that I needed to interview them separately. And that was going to be the only way to really get to the kind of core of their own experience. And actually, I don't think they had been, they've all got their own projects, but they haven't often been interviewed over long periods of time on their own. And I think that was really vital to get those moments that was about the band, but also, as you say, like resonated with other people about the sort of emotional experience behind it.
How do you prep for something like that in terms of when you do the actual shoot day? Because you've mentioned about gaining their trust, but when it comes to the day itself, because as audience members, we get 3 episodes and it's all edited down, but I can imagine that it could be a whole day of them talking and you sort of keeping them engaged in what they're talking about and kind of keeping them on the track of what's relevant and what's not relevant.
Yeah, I spent a really long time on kind of interview prep, and it obviously starts before with obviously meeting them and then watching everything and doing all of that. And then I sort of start working out what are the sort of story beats that I want to kind of get through that are really relevant. And then within those story beats, I have like lots and lots of different questions. And often those questions are just sort of different ways of asking the same thing, because you don't really know how they're going to react to certain things. And sometimes the first answer isn't quite getting to the root of it. And also, a lot of it is about the sort of ordering of the questions. If you know someone's going to get quite emotional about a certain thing, what do you want to have before and what do you want to have after that? Where do you want to have your breaks? We interviewed them for probably like 4 or 5 hours on 2 separate days. So you've got sort of 8 to 10 hours of interview with all of them. And by the end of those 4 or 5 hours, like they're going to be really knackered and the energy levels are going to drop. So you don't want your most important questions to be there. So it's sort of that process is quite complicated. And then when I get into the interview chair, yes, I have my questions sort of around me, but I sort of don't look at them, because then you want to sort of be reacting off what they're saying. And then in the breaks, you can kind of go back and be like, hey, did I miss anything? And, I've got an amazing team around me, the producers and series producers and execs are also listening and making sure that I've got that extra set of ears, that making sure I don't miss anything. but yeah, huge amount of prep on the day and making them feel comfortable, and also trying to understand like from them. I know like with Keith, he would always tell, he had quite long anecdotes, and I think at the beginning I was sort of trying to, I know how I want to go to this bit, and actually he just needed to be able to do the space to be able to do all of his anecdotes, and then we could get to like the core of it. So it's also trying to understand their way of being interviewed and sort of adapting to their style as well. And sometimes I didn't even ask a question. I would just make an observation about something they had said, which then gets them to open up a little bit more of into the next layer. And then you have all these other interviews like with them, the tabloid journalists or journalists or Louis Walsh, and they have to be approached in a completely different way as well because they're different people. So yeah, so there's a sort of prepping for the interview bit, and then there's obviously like the prep for like the visual side, what I want them to look like and things like that.
I do. I'm interested to talk about the sort of Brest and Louis Walsh side because I feel like there's a lot of contention that's shown in the doc itself, and I feel like there's like a big conversation, but I would say that for the moment. What's interesting is just like how different the boys are and how you need to sort of differently, you have to navigate differently with them. And I guess if I can imagine it's a little bit difficult as well because if you are concentrating on the interview, but then also if you have everybody else in the background as well, just listening in as well and maybe adding something saying, or maybe ask this or ask that. How do you cope with like balancing between the two?
Yeah, I mean, I you sort of forget about all the other people, and they'll never be in. I'll never want them like in the room because I think that is also distracting for the person being interviewed. So they're often sort of hidden in different corners, and I think there's so much sort of adrenaline when you're interviewing someone because you're thinking about, what have they just said? And what have I picked up on the right thing? Okay, they've mentioned something there that I want to pick up on later, and I need to remember it. And have I done this? And so there's so many, and the whole time you're trying to be relaxed and easy and breezy, and so there's so many different things going in your mind that you're not really thinking about kind of who else is in the room. And but then we have breaks, and in those breaks, I'll just go and speak to like my producer, who was an amazing producer called Freddie Hewlett, and I'll be like, have I missed anything? Or he might pick up on the fact that they said something, we got a number 3 with that song, and actually it went to number 2. So he's listening, and I don't have enough brain capacity to be checking those facts as well. So it is really useful to have another set of ears, and they might just pick up on something that you haven't. But we do those in the break, like so that, and they're not in my eye line or in the person I'm interviewing's eye line because I think it's really distracting. So they're often sort of hiding in a wardrobe or a sort of side room or something with some headphones. But it can be quite intimidating, I think, especially if you've got executive producers listening. You're a bit like, oh God, am I being observed and watched as well? But as soon as I start interviewing, you're so focused that there's not really much space to be worrying about anything else.
Yeah, fair enough. It was curious because I wonder what it's like sometimes if yeah, if you're in the middle of an interview and you just hear something come through your earpiece or something, and then
Oh no, no, no! I
yeah,
can't have any of that. And
okay, good.
sometimes also the DOPs will give me a monitor as well, so I can sort of see the shot. And I'm just like, no, I can't. I just you just have to trust that the shots that you've set up and worked with the team is working. Some people will be able to do that, but I just go like full like tunnel vision, and I can't look at anything else or hear anything else.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And as well, if you're, the whole point of like having other crew around is like to let them do what's right in terms of like a DOP with the
Mm.
shot set up. But then also, and what was quite interesting as well about the interview process is how the camera's set up. And because when you've got all the boys and some of the press, it's like they're looking down the barrel of the lens, which feels like, as an audience member, it's like they're talking directly to you and addressing you, which I always found you kind of get like slight, not goosebumps, but you feel that sort of more intimate setting of it. Is that creative decision that came early on, or is that something that happened just on the day?
No, so that was a really, really early on decision. And it's used a lot, it is used a lot in documentaries. It's really powerful. But I knew it because they had been interviewed so many times before. I really wanted these interviews to feel different from those other interviews that they had done, where they're talking to like a presenter or they just had, I knew in the archive they hadn't been interviewed in this style before. So also it would be quite different for them as an experience, which would hopefully make it feel quite fresh. And also that sort of it would feel quite confessional. And so there was quite a lot of prep. And actually I sort of just there's a piece of equipment that we often use for those, a sort of mirror box, but actually you couldn't use a particularly wide lens with that mirror box because of the sort of the shape of it. But I really wanted a wide shot for this A camera. So we actually sort of built our own Interatron mirrorway system like specifically for this project, which took a really long time to set up, and working with Will Belaney and Steve Middlewich, the two DOPs, about what the different shots and framing would be and wrecking the location, because it's so much of your documentary are these shots. So I had to spend like a lot of time thinking about how I wanted them to feel and the environment and the color and all of those things. So yeah, it was quite it was quite a long process to set up those shots, but I really liked them in the end, so it was good.
And I think they work well in the doc itself. I'm just curious because I know because everybody was in sort of like a casual setting, but there's one journalist where you interviewed him in the car. Was that a creative choice, or was that something that they wanted it to be done, or was it just a sort of having that like I'm a journalist, so I'll be like hiding in the shadows sort of feel?
Yeah, I so that yeah, again, that was a creative choice because you had your characters that everyone knows really well and you come back to them. I often find that sometimes with like supporting cast and a sort of chorus of voices that you sort of you're trying to find something visual that people goes, oh, that's that character or that's that character. And we had two tabloid journalists in the documentary, and one of them was Rav Singh, and talking to him he was very much kind of in and out of bougie nightclubs and private members clubs, and that was sort of his, and he was sort of in the snazzy hotels, and that was his sort of style of journalism. And then Paul felt a bit more kind of rough and ready, and he was sort of jumping over fences and kind of sort of tricking his way into places. And so I had this idea about doing it in this car, and it felt sort of underground. And I love that shot. I mean, it was we hired a car, that a sort of 90s BMW, and he rocked up and he was like, I had a car like that when he was in the 90s. And it just made that, I think it just, you just remember that character more because they had that visual sort of difference, I think, rather than having everyone in sort of similar spaces. And it just turned out like really well.
Yeah, because at first I was thinking, I was like looking at it as a creative choice, thinking this is kind of funny to see because everybody's in like a bar or a location, and then you got this guy in the car, and it made me chuckle at first, I won't lie. But then once you sort of understand the difference between the two journalists, it made all the sense in the world. Whilst we're sort of still on the subject of journalists, band themselves were under a lot of scrutiny. Their manager, Louis Walsh, selling, leaking stories or sending fake stories as well, which kind of blows my mind a bit because there's even a bit where he will say about a plane crash and it's like, oh wait, I haven't told their parents that it's made up. As someone, as a filmmaker, there seems to be like, how do you go about inserting those sort of stories and sort of more of a, should we say, darker side of the boys' fame and music into the story itself? But do you feel there's also you have a certain moral obligation to it as well? Because some of it's made up, some of it's actually extremely hurtful, well, beyond hurtful, it's sort of outing people for their sexuality or blaming sexuality for their death, for someone's death, for Stephen Gately's death, sorry. How do you deal with that side of it as well?
There was so much press, and that was always going to be like quite a big theme and story throughout the series. And we used some of these we created these sort of graphics of these headlines so people could kind of see the stuff that was being written. And I think the editors did a really good job. There was sort of different sections. So there was one that was probably a bit humorous about like them turning down dates with Mariah Carey and all of those sort of moments. And then there was the stuff that was got more and more challenging. And I think with that, we wanted to make sure that one, I challenged the journalists and we challenged Louis on that. And then just kind of let them sort of speak their own truth on it. And and then I wanted to show what that felt like for the guys on the other side. I mean, unfortunately, we never got to interview Stephen, but we tried to find as much sort of archive and audio recording of him. But he hadn't really been asked about it in lots of detail, but we did find some small bits so we could get like his reflection on it and having his sister in it as well. But and it is hard to like listen, and Louis talks about like making up stories and he finds it quite comical in times, about the plane crash and things like that. But I think it was also right that we sort of showed how difficult it was for the people that the stories were being written about.
Yeah, because I think as audience members, I found it quite difficult to watch. It felt like I don't know, it just felt very, oh, this is part and parcel of what you've signed up for. Get on with it, sort of thing. And in a way, like a lot of, there's also like a lot of talk online is about how bad Louis Walsh comes off. And there's obviously ways of how people would like to present themselves and how they're going to be interviewed. But I think in a way, like a lot of people are right with how he does come off and how he does present himself and talk to people. Because there's even moments where I feel like he doesn't necessarily want to be there because he'll be like, oh, is it time to go? Or I'll be finished. I'm going to go do this. And even when he's on his break, he feels a bit sort of like, it feels like it's sort of just a routine for him rather than that he's like actually being part of a big documentary.
Yeah. I mean, Louis is a complicated character. In my mind, I think. On one he's sort of on one hand, he's sort of very, he really cared for the guys in some ways, and then in some ways, his sort of ways of managing were really challenging and conflicting. And I don't know, it's difficult to know like what, Louis doesn't walk around thinking like, oh, I'm this villain or anything like that. People don't do that. But, he is sort of unashamedly honest about the truthfulness of the industry. And then I think it's kind of up to the audience to make their own perception of how they feel about that. And also the passage of time, he wasn't working in this sort of vacuum that he was this like, rogue manager. That was truthful for the time and the kind of world they were living in. You didn't have social media and you didn't have all these things. So the way to keep the in the press and make them successful was through the tabloids, and there was a lot of sort of colluding between the sort of managers and the press. So they was sort of they needed each other. And I know that the guys, have a huge amount of respect for him in terms of how successful he made them. So it's but yeah, look, he was a fascinating person. I was really glad he was part of the series, because I think he was a really important part of their story and he was a sort of fascinating person to interview. I don't know how many of these sort of interviews he's done before, but I really wanted to sort of find out if there was a sort of how he felt about it now and if there was sort of reflective side of him. But actually, I think was quite interesting what he said was like, I do even more now. And that's just, that's what his sort of opinion was. And I think that's probably shows that actually it's probably not that different now. It's probably still the same. And there's definitely sort of double-edged sword, I think, with fame.
I can imagine it's slightly different now because of social media and how quick we can get news onto our phones. And in a way, it's like probably made it worse because you could just literally drop some tidbit of information or somebody can run with something and you're like, oh my gosh, this must be true or this is not true. And there's not
Mm.
necessarily a fact check. It's not necessarily fact checked when it comes out compared
Mm.
to maybe back then with newspapers because people have their sources and they need to be fact checked and because they'll need, if not, they could get taken to court and then have the like a is it redact they can
Yeah,
redact
exactly.
its
Yeah,
statement,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. But there were still lots of sort of fake stories being written about people because actually, if the manager calls a journalist and says this is what's happened, then you're like, cool, I've got my source, and it doesn't matter if the information coming out is true or false. So yeah, and I can imagine that's like, and I don't know from sort of the documentary, actually it was really hard for them to like listen to stories that weren't true. So yeah.
There are emotional moments, especially when it comes to those sort of stories where you see with Stephen Gately's sister and even Ronan himself. How do you navigate their emotions? Because in a way, you're opening up old wounds and getting a very strong emotional response from them. How do you then take a break after doing stuff like that, or do you sort of bring them back into the interview to then not steer away from what's happened, but to sort of go for a more positive outlook of what has happened?
Yeah, yeah, definitely about the sort of timing. I mean, it's interesting when you are interviewing people and it's about a really emotional topic. Often, like as sort of humans, you want to stop that because it's never nice to see someone upset. And I have to fight so many instincts within myself as a person not to kind of stop in that moment. And as soon as someone gets upset, kind of, should we take a break or anything? But actually kind of know that it is their moment to be able to talk about something that's really difficult to them. And so often you have to fight that instinct to sort of break the interview and give them space, and also not put your own feeling on them. Often, your feeling is like, I don't want to be upset. I'd find that really difficult. But actually, the person that you're interviewing has lived that. And you ask them questions, yes, it's going to bring it up, but it's never going to be as bad as the thing that they've actually lived or anything like that. So I think you have to fight some of those instincts. But then you have to kind of understand the timing of it. You don't need to keep asking the same question again if someone's got emotional. And I do tend to kind of then say, if someone's got upset, do you want a break? And sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. And then that interview plan comes into play, where afterwards you're thinking, okay, cool, what's the next thing that I want to ask about? You'd probably don't want to go into something like super light, but it might be something that's just a bit sort of easier to, or something that's quite factual based. So I think, yeah, a little bit about the timing and just trusting your instincts about if you've got it, do you need to stop? And yeah, but yeah, it's hard because you do want to sort of jump in there and give them a hug, but you can't.
It's so difficult because, as you said, you want to jump in and give them a hug, but then also you have to stay professional and maintain what you're doing. Um,
Yeah, and while you're there, they've come to tell you their story, and you've had these conversations with them before, and they want you don't want them to come to the end and feel like, oh God, I didn't really say the thing I wanted to say. So they know why they're there. You spent enough time talking about them and stuff like that. So you don't need to sort of carry the sort of, oh, well, I don't want them to be upset kind of sort of feeling, because actually you're giving them space to be able to share something that's really important to them.
Yes, of course. And it must be so difficult when you're sitting there, though, just in that moment. And how do you get that right balance of like being human, but then also staying on track to on with the interview as well?
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely, and it works, lots of ways. Like if you're challenging someone in an interview, it's like, oh God, do I want to keep asking them and pushing them and being quite, because sometimes you really have to sort of challenge someone and challenge their not a sort of a family member, but some of the journalists, you want to challenge them, and that can feel quite, can feel quite uncomfortable. But that is your sort of job. But then, yeah, again, if they're getting upset, we do take a break, and we do let people just sort of take a moment, and I do give them a hug. As soon as we've sort of there's a moment of pause, I will get up, and if it's the right thing to do, give them a hug, and actually often you do find that they, after, especially if once they've seen the program come out, they feel really sort of grateful for like the experience and stuff. But no, it is one of the harder bits.
I can imagine as well, like it's a way of people hearing their voice as well.
Mm.
Whilst, especially like with Stephen's sister, where there's two obviously that stand out about his sexuality, but also when he died, and it's kind of like you want to, as audience member, you want to sort of like shout at the screen to be like, this is so wrong. But then when you hear like coming from like family member, it's like that's when it kind of feels even more real because it's not just the band that get affected, it's also family members, it's close friends because they're, I don't want to say like not tricked into, not tricked, but it's the false pretenses of what they're doing and how people are getting stories about them. And I understand that they had to protect their sources, but at the same time, you kind of think like, didn't need to run that, did you?
Mm. Mm. Yeah, I think with especially with Stephen, and then writing the article about, that he was gay. I mean, so essentially what happened was they were going to write an article, so he decided to write it with them, and him and his partner at the time, Eloy, who was also in the documentary, they sat down and they gave an interview, and so they could put it in their own words, and so they took a bit of sort of ownership back from it. But obviously that meant them sort of, working with the tabloid journalists sort of on that. But yeah, and all of it has ripple effects to the sort of people around them, and their loved ones and stuff. So yeah.
And also it's like I want and now like mental health is a big thing. I wonder what their mental health must have been like at that time because obviously it's not such a big talked about thing, but knowing that you're going through something like this is like how alone you must have felt, Stephen himself, and how it's like you're basically being forced into doing this. And even though they have like some ownership to it, it feels like it's like your hands are tied, so you kind of just have to do it.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think he obviously had like the other band members, and he had Eloy, who was incredible, and they were doing it together. And I'm sure all of those factors made it slightly more bearable. But there was, so much sort of fear and paranoia, and yeah, and although just that feeling of sitting in your own house, knowing the next day something so personal and private is going to be everywhere, and it went like worldwide, and you're sat in your house knowing that all these people are sort of seeing this information, that I yeah, it must be absolutely horrendous.
It kind of like my mind doesn't really comprehend it as well, just because your life just being so, dug in and just how, yeah, like what do you do? What like poor guy, um, like yeah, it was just really really bad. What I'm also curious to know about, because this was came on earlier on, how you met with the three boys, but then Mikey was someone who came on a lot later on, and his interviews, it feels like he's very diplomatic about what had happened to him in the band and how he sort of ended stuff. And it struck me quite a lot because I can imagine that as if you've had a bit of a rough time with it, or towards the end it was slightly becoming a soured experience. You could be a very like spiteful person and say a lot of bad things about others. And when it came to his interviews, was there any way of like trying to find out more about why he disliked the band, or was it a case of he's made his peace with it, let's just see what he says and try to extract more information from his answers?
Yeah, I mean, Mikey is I really enjoy Mikey. He really was quite a sort of deep psychological thinker. And I think what he was sort of able to do was articulate the sort of broadness of his experience without sometimes going into like, sort of real sort of this person said this and this person said this. Because I think, how do I want to put it? I think the thing is that sometimes those arguments, it's not really about the specifics of what those arguments were. It wasn't about, that person said this and this person said this. It was about kind of what the actual bigger experience that contributed to that. And I think we wanted to be really careful that it wouldn't, although you understood there was a conflict, that we weren't getting into sort of a nastiness. And I think he really wanted that. Like he didn't want to sort of stir up, some like the stuff from the past, but he wanted to be able to sort of be able to share the experience of what he went through. So it is really difficult. And the edit process is so key, and having the trust for them. And also you don't want people to self-edit in those interviews. So you want them to be able to say everything how they feel like they can say it, knowing that you've had lots of conversations about how much they're willing to go into. Because actually, if people start to sort of self-edit in the interview process because they don't trust you, what you're going to do in the edit, then you never really get to the right level. If that makes sense. I always sort of encourage people to just go, it's better to say a little bit more and then we can edit it back than not quite say enough, and then afterwards it's confusing and you don't understand it and it's talking in riddles. So yeah, so it was and there's a lot of politics there and there's a lot of conflict and stuff, and you don't need to go into everything, but we did want to be truthful and be able to sort of get into like the crux of it, which is like the pressures of fame and how they felt about each other and the dynamics within the band without it getting too personal.
If you had someone who self-edits whilst they're doing the interview, how do you combat something like that? Or do you just have to sort of roll with it and then try think how you can mold it in the edit suite?
Yeah, it can be really, really hard if someone's sort of only willing to give so much and they're giving quite sort of what feels like, that's why people when people say like, oh, can I know the questions beforehand? I'm like, no, never. Because what happens is people practice what they're going to say, and that's what they say. So I think it's about one, not doing that, which is really important. And then the more conversational you can make it. So actually, I sort of stop asking questions. And then when they say something, I'll just sort of make an observation about what they've said, like you would have in a normal conversation. It's hard because in a normal conversation, you tend to talk over each other. And in these interviews, you can't. And so it doesn't allow you to flow like you would in a normal conversation. But I might just break that and do that for a bit where it's just more bouncing off each other. And then when you're in the edit, you just have to just the magic of the editors will just have to try and pull together what they can. But some interviews are really difficult, can be really difficult.
I do like that you don't pass the questions on because, as you said, people rehearse it and then you're you don't necessarily get like a genuine, not genuine answer, but a genuine reaction. And I can imagine that's very difficult then to sort of carry on and try ask follow-up questions because they've
Yeah,
rehearsed so much in their mind.
it never goes
And
well if you ever do that, it never goes it never goes well. And people, some people do ask, and you have to be really honest. Like, I know that you will end up doing a much worse interview if you have these questions. Obviously, you can talk about the sort of, these are the sort of subject areas that we might talk about, and you want people to be really engaged and think about it beforehand. But I sort of say, but it's a benefit for you as much as for me, because I know this interview will be bad if you've got the questions. So yeah, it's really important.
That's a really sort of interesting and fascinating point about sort of interview prep. But yeah, that's quite. I'll remember that next time somebody asks for my questions when I have to interview them.
And
Um,
also, just you also have to remind them that, like, they know the answers. I'm not asking them I'm asking about their own life, and actually, if they don't know the answer to them, then it's not the right question as well. If they don't have an answer to it, then that's also fine, and I will ask a different question. So I think it's also about letting them know that there sort of are no wrong answers. Whatever their truthful reaction to that question is the right answer, and I don't need anything else.
yeah, that's a really good way of looking at it as well because you essentially they are talking about their work, but then also if they're not truthful in the way they answer it, then what's the point in a way?
Mm.
I don't know, it's just fascinating. It's just I feel like there's like a you could do a deep dive into all of it. And it's like the psyche of people, and like the
It
questions
does feel like that
asked.
sometimes. You are trying to work out, you're trying to sort of psychoanalyze people, and how will they react to this moment, and how will they feel about this, and if they've said this, does that actually mean that, this is how the emotion fit? Like, you do feel sometimes like you're sort of this pseudo psychologist trying to work out who someone is and why they do the things that they do.
And I think you kind of see that in documentary as well, and you kind of get a reckoning from certain people and band members. I think even when Ronan's going to do his own thing, I think he kind of realizes how how his behavior was not really acceptable and kind of like pushed people away. Then also I quite liked when they said about how nervous they were to meet up again in the hotel room, but then it just felt like they were back to normal again.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I
So
love I love when you I love a moment in any interview where someone says something about how they felt at the time, and then they come to it with a whole new perspective. Not everyone's sort of able to do that, or has a new perspective, but I think that's always really satisfying if they tell you a story, and then they tell you how they look at it now, and looking back, if they have different emotions and feelings towards it, it just gives it a sort of deeper level.
yes, and I guess another way, like there's so much sort of pent up anger over people as well, and stuff could get quite heated, but really you kind of think when you're in the moment, kind of let it go, and you're just like, actually, this is what has been missing, and this is what we really enjoy, and they want to sort of bring that back together. And I think you see that as well, like even in the final scenes, I know we don't have Mikey with the rest of the boys, but they're still together and they're still having that banter, and it feels like there's like a you can see the camaraderie between them all, and like they've sort of been in the trenches with it, but then also can kind of like be comfortable around one another still.
Yeah, and that scene was really, I think us as sort of humans, we all want this sort of happy ending and this sort of perfect ending. And, the fact that Mikey didn't decided not to come, you're like, oh God, would it be lovely to see them all together? But actually that's not truthful, and you have to react to the truth of how they feel in that moment, and what's right for them. And the editor who did edit episode 3, Chris Johnson, he really did this really beautiful moment where they sort of lift up their pints, and then he cuts to Mikey on his own drinking his pint. And I just thought, oh, that was just a really lovely, like, visual reflection of the fact that they'll always sort of be connected, but they might sort of not be sort of emotionally in the same room together.
Yeah, and yeah, it's a great cut. I felt a twinge of sadness though because Mikey was by himself in the pub having a pint whilst the guys were all together. but then that is, their choices and their decisions on how they want to move forward. Just to hit you up with my final question, what was your favorite interview to do?
Oh God, that is so hard. It's like when people the whole way through the production, we always sort of everyone was always asking like, who's your favorite member of Boyzone? And it would literally change all of the time, which was my favorite. It just feels like that. I feel like disloyal because I want to be loyal to all of them. But I will be very honest. I tell you who I found just deeply, deeply fascinating, and actually probably would want to just make a whole documentary just about him was actually Shane. he he just had a way of being able to sort of articulate emotions and experiences. He had this sort of great combination of sort of humor, where there's a moment where after the late late show he's like, I'm on telly, I'm doing a little dance, or he would say a line and then just stop speaking, which actually lots of people sort of don't do. Or he was able to sort of articulate sort of how they felt around the band and fame. And I think I always just found his way of phrasing certain things, really fascinating. But, I have to say, like, I didn't know what they were all going to be like an interview. And I did worry that there'll be at least one of them that would kind of just give sort of their stock answers. And each of them just gave me so much emotion. And I remember the first interview with Ronan, just thinking, because he's done the one show and he does magic and he is just in that world. And I remember thinking, okay, wow, yeah, he really he really went for it, and he really showed a lot of emotion and vulnerability that I didn't know that I was like definitely going to get hoped for. And yeah, as I said, Mikey was like a really deep psychological thinker, and Keith was just had like humor, but then he was just so vulnerable at the same time. So yeah, I've sort of answered it, and then I've gone back to sort of saying all of them.
Again, it's like saying pick your favorite child. It's impossible, and especially if you're still in contact with them, that's another thing where it's like, they hear this, they'll be like, "Hey man, what happened here? I thought I was your favorite," and you're like, "Uh-oh, I
Yeah,
don't want to get you in hot
exactly.
water." But
Changes all the time. It does. It changes. Whoever I get off the phone to then becomes my favorite, and then I'll speak to someone else and they'll become my favorite. But no, it was it was really nice. It was like it's hard with celebrity. You don't know how much they're going to have a barrier and a membrane. And I was really grateful that they just decided, like, yeah, if we're going to do it, we're going to do it properly.
And especially because we are seeing more and more of these type of documentaries. I think we saw like the
Mm,
David Beckham one, Robbie Williams one. Like again, like you're getting that. I feel like when you have individuals, the barrier is still quite up just because of who they are and their level of fame. Especially somebody like David Beckham, where yeah, global superstar, model, ambassador, probably missing
yeah.
a few other little titles as well. But with this, yeah, it's just different. And
Yeah, it was my it's like it's my biggest fear. They've got a lot of people around them. They're so used to being, guarded, and then you're, and they have to be, and then you're literally just saying to them, all of those years and years and years of training of being really guarded, I now you want to forget all of that and trust me over anyone else that you've ever spoken to. And that is really difficult, and that's my biggest fear. And I think and you just never, as much as you have these conversations in the build up to filming, you just never know when that camera goes on, whether their natural instinct just to go, cool, I'm not going to be personal, I'm going to give you my stock answers, comes in. So yeah, I was just grateful that didn't happen.
no, and that's fantastic as well. And you see it, proof is in the pudding, with the show. Sophie, thank you so much for your time today.
And thank you very much for having me.
Boyzone, no matter what, is streaming now on Sky Documentaries. Go out, watch Sophie's work, enjoy it. You'll probably laugh, you'll probably cry, you'll probably get annoyed as well. But yeah, take that ride on that roller coaster and enjoy it. Thank you again, Sophie. You take care and bye bye.
Bye, speak to you soon. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast.